Welcome back, everybody. Our next guest is a writer and journalist whose works have appeared in some of the world's biggest publications. Well, now she has a debut novel. It is entitled You Exist Too Much. And this is following a queer Palestinian woman navigating the conflicting cultural, religious, and sexual facets of her identity while trying to mend her personal relationships. So this book has been selected as a most anticipated book of the year by numerous publications, Vogue, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, among many, many others. We are thrilled to have the author with us today. Please welcome to the show, Zaina Arafat. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Zaina, let's start with the title of this book, You Exist Too Much. And straight away, I feel like I relate to this title, and I imagine others do. But tell us, what does it mean for you specifically?
The title of the book is spoken by the mother character to the narrator of the book. And to tell somebody you exist too much is essentially to tell them to exist less, to take up less space in the world, right? To live with a degree of shame or feeling the need to apologize for one's existence. And so that title, You Exist Too Much, basically she's spending the entire book resisting that and coming into her own and getting to a place of shame and sort of feelings of self-loathing, to a place of self-acceptance and validation, and being able to really live as she is without apology as a queer Palestinian woman, Palestinian American woman.
Let's talk about her. Let's talk about your intent in this book, because as you mentioned, the main character of the book, she is a young bisexual Palestinian woman. And it seemed like you were intent on really subverting a lot of the stereotypes of Arab people, of queer identity as well. So what are some of the tropes or the narratives that you really wanted to work against, write about in this novel?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was working against, tropes that had emerged regarding Arabs and Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11, the Iraq War, just like the general climate of like Islamophobia in the U.S. And ideas that all Muslims and Arabs are terrorists, for one thing, or that all Arab Muslim women are repressed or oppressed, that they all look and dress in a certain way. And I wanted to really kind of humanize what a Arab actually, could look like, based on my own experiences as an Arab, coming from an Arab family, traveling to the region every year, and just like having spent years of my life living there, and basically seeing that the images that people were subjected to on television were not at all matching the reality, at least as I was experiencing it, and as many Arabs and Muslims experience it.
Throughout your career, and you've done a heck of a lot of work as a journalist, including writing for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic, have you faced a lot of resistance in your attempt to deviate from those stereotypes?
Yeah, absolutely, I have. I've had editors sort of speak to me and ask for more kind of violence or more of wanting to see more of those like traditional, just like stock images sort of perpetuated, and those narratives perpetuated. And so, yeah, my work as a journalist and a lot of the resistance that I faced in trying to subvert those narratives led me to fiction.
So this book, you say you wanted to, above all, write a story that was human, all the while providing a much more deeper, richer, nuanced look at what life is like as a Palestinian. What is it that the West most misunderstands about the Palestinian lived reality today?
I think that I think that when you hear the word Palestinian, most Western audiences simply think of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and maybe they think of, acts of violence as well. Maybe they think of, the occupation and all of these things that, certainly, Palestinians have been living under occupation. Many Palestinians for, since 1967. However, I think that what I want people to recognize about Palestinians is that they are human beings just like anybody else who have the same, desires for like economic prosperity, for the well-being of their children, for their own families, for they have longings, they basically are not that different than us here in the West, right?
I love that, Zaina, a great deal. But I want to talk about sort of a difference that you highlight in the book, and that's between being a gay woman in Arab culture versus being a gay man. Can you speak to that difference?
Yeah, I think that there are many expectations about, many standards, I suppose, that Arab women, that exist in Palestinian society and Arab society on the whole, that can be sort of limiting for women. There's an expectation of femininity. There's an expectation of like, wanting to marry a man, basically. And it's, I think because, we're still resisting the patriarchy globally, and also in Arab society, being a gay Arab woman or a bisexual Arab woman can be that much more of an affront, because it really does sort of challenge the patriarchy in a way that society is still sort of coming to terms with. So yeah, I must say though, in the recent years, I have seen such more and more visibility of like gay and bisexual Arab women, which has been really heartening for me. So.
Another thing that you explore in this novel is externalized homophobia versus internalized homophobia that this character experiences. Why did you want to focus on that?
Well, so I think that it's easy to overlook how much of the homophobia that queer people face comes from within. I mean, largely because we live in a really heteronormative society where, if we don't conform to those societal standards in terms of our sexuality, we feel a great deal of shame, And so I think there's so much homophobia that exists externally, of course, we see that all the time. But at the same time, one of the biggest obstacles is that homophobia that's coming from within, and that lack of self-acceptance, and that sort of living in shame. And so for me, I just found it really interesting to explore that, because I hadn't really seen it fully realized in fiction.
Well, you certainly explored the challenging relationship between the mother and the daughter in this book. And it sort of exposes a larger theme about the tensions between the immigrant generation and the first generation. Why did you want to explore this intergenerational tension, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in our current day and age, I mean, I think that if you look around, I mean, there's just been such an influx of people coming from, all over the world. And one thing that I myself, grew up with is, I grew up in an immigrant family as a first generation Palestinian American. And I noticed that more and more people around me were from immigrant families and were kind of experiencing a lot of the tensions that exist between our own generation and that of our parents, because our parents are, in many ways, they were raised in a totally different culture, and there's this sort of simultaneous desire on their part to retain that culture and to impart it to their children, but also to allow their children to sort of assimilate to this adopted homeland. And I find that in that sort of space between assimilation and cultural retention between generations, there's a lot of material to explore, and just a lot of tension and a lot of nuance and a lot of interesting interactions, and just it's just a really rich area that I wanted to really explore.
Well, Zaina, we are certainly all richer for you having explored that. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been lovely.
The book is called You Exist Too Much, and it's available everywhere right now. We'll be right back.